Okay, guys, this is the first episode of my series leading up to the 2016 election, where I make videos basically talking about basically lecturing you about every election from the 68 election to the 2012 election. And of course, when this current election ends, and I'm actually here in Connecticut for the day, watching, at the time I record this, I'm in Connecticut for the day, watching on the television. Um, I'm watching the results of the Super Tuesday Connecticut primary as they come in. So I decided to start with 1968 because because there's so many parallels between that election and the election that is currently going on. So I thought, hey, why not talk about that first? So first, let's talk about the Democratic primaries for this election. Okay, so the incumbent president was Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson was originally the vice president to John F. Kennedy, but then Kennedy was assassinated. So Johnson became president. He ran for a full term in 1964. And we can talk about that another time. I don't know if I'll eventually make a video on the 1964 election, but he chose Hubert Humphrey, a longtime Democratic senator, to be his running mate, and he defeated Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee from Arizona, by a landslide. Fun fact: the Senate seat that used to be held by Barry Goldwater is now held by John McCain, the Republican nominee in 2008, and also a candidate in 2000. But that's a story for another day. Um, but in this election, in this 1968 election, what happened is, yes, um, if Lyndon Johnson had run this year, yeah, even though he would have served more than 8 years in office, had he chosen to run this election and gotten, reelected, well, and won, he would have served more than 8 years. However, Johnson was still he was still eligible to run, because the term, the from 1963 to 1965, that time period was more so just filling in, his time for Kennedy. Um, But with this, if he had run in 1960, 68 and won, he was still allowed to run in 1968 if he wanted to. And originally he intended to. Now, Johnson, the Vietnam War, what had happened with that, it was very unpopular. However, Johnson still maintained popularity. And then he agreed that even people that were opponents of the Vietnam War, agreed that the hippie movement had gone way too far. So what had happened was, they, uh, because of that, there weren't really that many people at first who were challenging uh, Johnson in the primaries. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy, he was rumored to run against uh, Johnson that year, but at first he said, "No, I'm not going to," because he thought, I can't beat Johnson this year. However, after the Tet Offensive happened, it was a huge failure, and Johnson's popularity plummeted. And keep in mind, he accomplished a lot during his term in office. The civil rights movement really, really got him, really made him very popular. But after the Tet Offensive, he was kind of becoming old news. So his first challenger in the primaries was Eugene McCarthy, and Eugene McCarthy, despite being a Democrat, was very anti-war, um, and this was very contrast to Johnson. McCarthy, at first it was a very contested, race between both Johnson and McCarthy. However, after eventually a couple other people entered, and right after McCarthy did really well in New Hampshire, this led Robert F. Kennedy to change his mind and actually enter that race and challenge Johnson. So immediately after that, uh, Lyndon Johnson, he put out a statement, a shocking and historic statement, where he said, and it's famous now, where he said that he would not run for re-election. He would not seek and he would not accept his party's nomination in 1968. Um, so right after that, the main guy who kind of almost replaced him, he was almost like his substitute, was Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president. Now, Humphrey didn't think he had much of a chance of winning that primary because, it was very contested between McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy at the time. So what he did was he went to states where there was no primary going on, and where the delegates were controlled by Mayor Delay, Mayor Daley, sorry, yeah, Mayor Daley. And Mayor Daley, he had endorsed Hubert Humphrey, and that was really the key for Humphrey. So eventually, what happened was Robert F. Kennedy was having a tough time going up against Eugene McCarthy, and McCarthy was very controversial for what he did in the 50s. And to this day, most people agree that McCarthy really screwed up in the 1950s with the McCarthy hearings and everything. Um, so what had happened was Robert F. Kennedy, he was having a tough time going up against McCarthy, and actually one of the people on his campaign um, actually said years later he wrote in his memoirs that he would that he probably if Robert F. Kennedy, if he had gone on, he probably would not have won that primary. So what happened after that was Robert F. Kennedy, in another shocking and historic move. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and this was shocking to a lot of people because John F. Kennedy John F. Kennedy, his brother, who was the president, was also assassinated. So this was huge, 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 huge. Um, and it really, got a lot of people shocked. Um, but after this, McCarthy was really the front runner, and the primary process between Humphrey and McCarthy got so weird that eventually McCarthy, um, what had happened was they had to take it to an open convention, something the Republicans have been threatening to do with Trump this election season. Um, so that's what they did, and so what happened was the hippies, they hated Johnson, they hated the hell they created the hey LBJ, how many kids did you kill today thing, which is horrible. They organized this group of people that would go down to Chicago, which was where the convention was being held, and they had this historic protest, something that I think over the summer Black Lives Matter threatened to do with the Republicans, um, because they thought the Democratic Party was a great party, but it had been taken over. To them, the Democratic Party had been taken over by pro-Vietnam people, and they felt like they were being stabbed in the back. So they had this, and at first they only wanted to have a peaceful protest, but things got out of hand, as they always do, and it turned into a riot. Um, and things really, really went crazy. But at this one open convention, they officially decided that Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, would indeed be the nominee for president of the United States for the Democratic side. So that finally puts that to rest. But next, you've got to realize what happened with the Republicans. Okay, so the front runner on the Republican side now, Nixon was sort of campaigning behind the scenes for a while, but he officially got in January of 1968, which seems pretty late. I mean, because by January 2016, this current election, that we were already kind of in the middle of the election by the time January came around for this election, for the 2016 election, with Trump and Cruz and everybody, and Bernie and Hillary. But keep in mind that Nixon was working very much behind the scenes, and Nixon, he had helped. First of all, he was the former vice president to beloved president. What was his name? Dwight Eisenhower. He was beloved. He was a beloved. He was the vice president to that beloved man, and that was the first thing. Second of all, the Republicans were very, very successful that in the 1966 the midterms. They were very successful in the 1968. That's the 1968, the 1966 midterms, and that was very much thanks to Richard Nixon. So what because of that, Richard Nixon immediately became the front runner for the Republican Party. But many people questioned many Republicans tried to take Nixon down because they were afraid Nixon could not win. Um, so the first person, and the reason people didn't think that was because, first of all, Nixon was actually the nominee in 1960, but he lost to John F. Kennedy. And also, 2 years later, he ran as the Republican nominee for governor of California, and he couldn't even win, a spot as the governor of California, and he lost to Pat Brown. So many Republicans thought that they were handing the race over to the other party if they were to nominate Richard Nixon. So there was really this effort to try and kick Nixon down. And so the first person who tried to do that was George W. Romney. Um, and George W. Romney was considered at one point to be the chief rival to Nixon. Kind of like how at the moment Ted Cruz is the chief rival to Donald Trump. Um, and so George Romney, he was, he was he ran on this. I think he was I can't remember. He was either pro Vietnam or anti Vietnam. I can't remember which one. But then he went to Vietnam on this fact finding trip. And what had happened was, um, after this trip, he made this very controversial statement about being brainwashed into taking this position on Vietnam, and that was really where he lost all support. So that was really what knocked him down. But then what had happened was Charles Percy um, was um, Charles Percy was also after Romney got out of the race. Charles Percy was considered a very he was considered a threat to Nixon. Um, however, um, he really hurt himself in Illinois, and that was really what really damaged his campaign. Um, but there was also a rumor that that Nelson Rockefeller would run that year because he ran in 60. I, I know he ran in 1960. I believe he ran in 1964 as well. He was the governor of my state, New York. But at first he was endorsing Jacob Javits, a senator, and that he was kind of the quote unquote favorite son. And Jacob Javits was a senator from New York. So, and obviously Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. So gradually, he'd endorse him. But Jacob Javits wasn't doing too well. So Nelson Rockefeller got in the race. But it was only a matter of time before he got knocked down. Um, and so then finally you got Ron. And by the way, I forgot to mention this: George W. Romney. Although George W. Romney did not win that election, his son, another Romney, actually had a future. But that is a story for another day. But the next person who was considered a big threat to Richard Nixon was the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. But by that point, it was too little, too late for Reagan. But this was not the end for Reagan. But again, like with Romney, that is a story for another day. So eventually, Nixon won the nomination, and he went up against Hubert Humphrey. Now, let's talk a little bit about the vice presidents. Um, what's his name? Richard Nixon uh, chose Spiro Agnew, the governor of Maryland, to be his vice president or his vice presidential running mate. And the running mate for Hubert Humphrey was Edmund Muskie, who was a very prominent Democrat, and I believe he was a senator. Yeah, he was a United States senator from Maine, and was later actually the the United States Secretary of State, believe it or not. And what had happened after this was the Democratic Party had been split into many different factions. You got the New Deal people, you got the hippie people, you got the anti-hippie people, the pro-war people, the anti-war people, all those people. So this led to it almost led to a fracture in the Democratic Party, and this led to George Wallace and running as a third party candidate as a part of the American Independent Party. And he was a candidate from Alabama, and he actually won a few states. He was the governor of Alabama, and he actually won a few states. His running mate was Curtis LeMay. He won a few states down in the South, and that really hurt Hubert Humphrey in the general election. But I think what really, really killed Humphrey was the fact that he was not able to motivate his voters very well. Nixon was able to do that much better than Humphrey was. So the if you look at the map, we can see that uh, Richard Nixon he won 32 states. The electoral vote for Nixon was 301, and Hubert Humphrey, he won 13 states plus D.C., and his electoral vote was 191. And George Wallace, he won. Uh, he got 40. The electoral vote for him was 46. He got 46 electoral votes, and he won 5 states. And I believe, yeah, Wallace was the last third party candidate to actually win a few states. Um, so yeah, in this election, um, you know, the Democrats had, Kennedy won in 1960, Johnson had won in 1964, but Nixon wasn't going to let Humphrey win in 1968. So in this election, we saw that Nixon actually won, and Spiro Agnew became the vice president. So, on our next episode, thank you guys for watching. On the next episode, we're going to be looking at the 1972 election. And keep in mind, by 1972, Richard Nixon is the incumbent president, and he is eligible to run for re-election. So we'll see that. So thank you guys for watching this first episode, and goodbye.